The heart of understanding music, in my opinion, is understanding note numbers, or what is also called scale degrees, or steps of the scale. Note numbers are the best way to get to grips with how musicians, especially non-classical musicians, think and talk about music. There are 7 different note numbers in an octave, plus the option of note 8. The numbers are simply 1 to 8. Note 1 can also be used instead of note 8 or vice versa, and they are an octave apart, hence the 8 for oct, as in octave. An octave is a doubling or a halving of the pitch. So if you play a note 1, then a note 8 will always be double the frequency of note 1. Continually ascending the sequence of numbers, by the way, note numbers are simply, the numbers 1 to 8 are simply the same as our default major scale. So if we continually ascend up the major scale or the note numbers, we will go 1 to 7 and then 1 to 7 again, and then the next octave up is 1 to 7. But if we just play a 1 octave scale, it's common practice to say 8 when we get to the high one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Note numbers also relate directly to the idea of musical intervals. In fact, an interval is simply the number gap between 2 note numbers. So between note number 1 and 6 we have a sixth. Also between note number 2 and 7 we have a sixth, because it's still 7 is still 6 numbers higher. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's no 0 in music. We have to remember. Likewise, between 1 and 4, that's called a fourth. Or between 2 and 5, that's also a fourth. 1 and 8, that's an eighth, or more commonly, an octave. So that's where our word octave comes from. It comes from our splitting into 8 notes, a doubling or halving of the frequency of a vibrating string. As note numbers in order, starting on note 1, are default the same as the major scale, they have a semitone between notes 3 and 4 and 7 and 8, and tones everywhere else. That's the formula of a major scale. Semitones between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8, and everywhere else is a tone. A semitone is equal to 1 fret on guitar, a tone is equal to 2. The white notes on a piano starting on C are also the same as these 7 note numbers. So C to C on a piano is note numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Going from left to right. Note numbers are also the same as Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do. It means exactly the same thing. Actually, it's Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Si, Do, but in English we've changed the C to a T for some reason. I recommend watching The Sound of Music. Okay, any combination of these note numbers is commonly called diatonic. Thus, the major scale is diatonic. The natural minor scale is also diatonic. The Dorian scale or mode is also diatonic because it comes from that combination of 5 tones and 2 semitones in that order. So diatonic doesn't just mean playing in the major mode or the major scale. It's also starting on any note in that scale, any of our numbers. That's diatonic. It's really just that combination of 5 tones and 2 semis in that grouping, with 2 tones between one semitone and 3 tones between the next semitone. Any melody is diatonic if it derives from these 7 notes, in any order. So the most simple melodies are diatonic, and I would say that the vast majority of all melodies, certainly in the Western tradition, are diatonic. Here is an example on the screen of a melody. So we have note numbers 5 5 3 5 3 1 2 3 4 2 5 3 1. They are simply steps of the default major scale. This tells us that we start on the 5th note of the major scale, then drop down to the 3rd, then back to the 5th, etc. We just follow the numbers. Musicians can thus immediately play or sing this melody before they know what it is, provided they know their note numbers on their instrument, or they can sing them. The musical key doesn't matter. The note numbers are simply the relationship between one note and the next. Important point, note numbers don't define the pitch. That goes on from what I've just said. Only the relationship, I said that twice, the relationship between the pitches. Thus, note 1 can be any of the 12 notes on your instrument per octave. If you are used to talking about musical letters, which are distinct pitches per octave, distinct frequencies, then in the key of G, for instance, note 5 is a D, G, A, B, C, D. Note 3 is a B, G, A, B. Note 1 a G, etc. If you wanted to play the above melody in a particular key, I would have to indicate that by adding in the key of G, for example. A note 3, for example, does not correspond to any particular pitch or letter note until you define the actual key. Excuse me. But the important thing in music is the relationship between the notes, not the key. I mean, a key is quite a irrelevant meaning in music, largely, I would say. Quite a misunderstood concept as well. Thus, the beauty of note numbers and their amazing versatility is that they don't change when and if you change the key. Changing key is just a shift of all the frequencies equally up or down, like slowing or speeding up a CD. And if you do that, the tune doesn't change, does it? If you remember record players, if you slowed down the record player, the tune didn't change. It just got slower. All the pitches changed. But unless you've got perfect pitch, you wouldn't be able to tell what the pitch was anyway, or what the key was. And luckily I haven't got perfect pitch. Accidentals. Accidentals are modified notes. Every melody can be written in note numbers, even if the notes deviate from the diatonic, in other words, the 1 to 7. So, example, you could write or play, of course, 1 flat 3, 3, 5. This indicates that we should just flatten note 3, but follow it with the normal note 3, or what's called a natural 3. So with the addition of 5 modified notes, 5 flats or sharps, because we can flatten or sharpen notes, we can write melodies using all of the 12 notes in music. And of course there are only 12 notes per octave in music. Of course we can bend notes, but we don't really notate bent notes or notes between notes. Well, not really anyway. Another important point, a flattened or sharpened note number bears no relationship to whether the corresponding letter note is a flat or a sharp. So if you're used to thinking about letter notes, G sharp, B flat, etc., the flat next to the letter has got no relationship to the accidental in the number sequence. In other words, a B flat could be a normal 4 in F major, in a particular key. It bears no relationship. So accidentals in the letter system, C to C, don't necessarily correspond to accidentals in the number system, because the letter system is fixed. A C is a specific pitch per octave, and the octave is just a doubling or a halving of that pitch. So if a C, whatever it is, I can't remember, an A, I know an A is 440, so if an A is 440, the A an octave above is A80 hertz or frequencies, or vibrations per second. 220 is an octave lower, 110 is an octave below that. They're all A's. They're specific pitches. They need to be specific, otherwise orchestras would sound awful, wouldn't they? Unless everyone knows exactly what an A is. Because unlike most modern musicians, orchestras don't change key willy-nilly. They understand note numbers, classical musicians, but they don't use them so much in practical terms. Now, note numbers are also the same as chord numbers. And a lot of musicians, particularly guitarists, are used to numbering chords. So you use note numbers already. Chord 1 is simply note 1 with the appropriate chord built on it. I say appropriate because we don't have the same chord built on each note number. But that's slightly off of the subject. So, chord 5 is built on note 5. Chord 2 is built on note 2. Thus, chord 4's root note, or the 1 in the chord, is note number 4 from the scale. Chord 6's root is note number 6 from the number sequence from the major scale. This is the basis of chord sequences, e.g. 1, 4, 5. So a chord sequence is also simply a note sequence. 1, 4, 5, 6, etc. is simply the same as chords 1, 4, 5, 6. As a matter of fact, if you were a bass player and you didn't play chords, which I would recommend, you will probably play the root note to each chord. So you think more in terms of note numbers as in rather than chord numbers. So 1, 4, 5, 6, 1, 4, 5, 6. Those are the chords, and the root note to each chord is simply the note numbers. 1, 4, 5, 6. Exactly the same. Because we can play chords and single notes on guitar, we have the choice. If you play clarinet or a monophonic instrument, you're thinking more in terms of single notes, or possibly arpeggios. Now, note numbers within chords. A simple chord consists of 3 notes, notes 1, 3 and 5, starting on the root note of the chord. This is the triad, the 3 important notes. Note 1, like I said, is the root of the chord. These notes make up a chord, these notes making up a chord are often called chord tones. But that means exactly the same as note numbers in the chord. So we differentiate between note numbers in the scale and note numbers in the chord, or chord tones. Note numbers within chords, i.e. chord tones, are always 1, 3, 5. Well, these simple chords are. Let's stick with that at the moment. They're always 1, 3 and 5. But the difference is the 1 replaces the note number that it's built on. So if you build a chord on note number 1, then the 1 of the chord is the same as the 1 of the scale, and the 3 of the chord is the same as the 3 of the scale, because we're starting the scale and the chord on the same note. But if we play a 2 chord, the chord built on note 2, our 1, 3 and 5 of the chord, in other words the root, the third, the fifth of the chord, starts on note 2 in the scale. So in this case, the 1 of the chord, the root note of the chord, is actually note 2 of the scale. So the 1, 3, 5 making up the triad, making up a chord, always stays like that. It always stays 1, 3, 5, and this makes for much clearer thinking and easy explanations, rather than talking about notes from the scale making up chords. Chord 4 is notes 1, 3 and 5, or the root, the third, the fifth, starting on note 4 of the scale. But we don't normally say that chord 4 is notes 4, 6 and 8 from the scale, because that starts to get confusing and it's not so obvious what the third and the fifth of the chord are. So when talking about notes making up a chord, it's much more straightforward and logical to speak in terms of chord tones, in other words, the notes in the chord, and not the actual note numbers from the scale. Also, because a chord can be in various different keys. So when talking about chords, we define our note numbers as being within the chord, or we can use the words chord tones, which is fine. I use both. Note numbers in the chord or chord tones. The understanding is the same, whatever conventional words you use. Thus, in conversation, one might say, in the G chord, sharpen the fifth, meaning sharpen chord tone 5 of the G chord. Or note number 5, starting on a G, same thing. The fifth, it's the fifth of the chord. One might say the sixth in the melody should always be flat. So here, it's obvious that I'm talking about the note number 6, because it's from the melody. I haven't mentioned chords or chord tones. So note number 6 is always simply the 6th note in the major scale from the melody. And it should be flat, of course. If you wrote that down as your own notation, you simply put a flat sign next to the 6 and repeat that, or use bars or whatever convention you use. Here are some equivalent notes. So using the two different ways of talking about numbers in music. Note number 6 is the same as the 3rd or chord tone 3 in chord 4. Note number 1 is the 7th of chord 2. So if we were playing in a particular key and I wanted to say I was talking about note 1 from the scale, I could also say I'm talking about note 7 from chord 2, depending on what musician I'm talking to and whether they relate to chords or not, or what is in the particular bar we're talking at the time. Also, note number 5 is the root of chord 5, of course. Note number 5 from the scale is the root or chord tone 1 of chord 5. Note number 2 is the 5th of chord 5, etc. So note number of the scale as opposed to chord tone, or the note numbers in the chord. So when to use note 8, which I mentioned earlier, and indeed 9, 10 and 11, possibly, although 8 and 9 much more common. Note 8 is, because it's a higher number, it is implied that it is above 1 to 7, of course. So if I ask you to play notes, say 1, 2, 6, 8, you will hopefully ascend to 8 from note 6. So you might 1, 2, 6, 8. But if I describe the 8 as a 1, which I could do, you will likely descend to the 1 or be unsure. So you might go 1, 2, 6. Is it down to the 1 or up to the 8? I'm not sure. Could be either. So a higher number tells us whether to ascend or descend, avoiding confusion. So if I want you to go up to the 8, obviously that's what 8 means, as opposed to down to the 1. So it clears up your direction of travel. If you go to a higher number, you always ascend up to it. That's why it's a higher number. Likewise with a 9. If the 8 is followed by a 9, it's one note higher. A 9 is the same as note 2, an octave up. The same as an 8 is the same as note 1, an octave up. It's particularly useful if you're writing melodies and you stick your head above the parapet into the higher octave, but only briefly. Say you might go up to note 8 a couple of times, and then you might go up to note 8 and 9. Rather than indicate the higher octave, just use number 9. And that also directly relates to numbers in chords as well, because we use 9s and 11s and 13s all the time in chords as well. And it's exactly the same principle. The 9 is the same as 2. But in a melody, the direction of travel is the important thing. In a chord, we can mix up the numbers in any combination. So if this 1, 2, 6, 8 melody continues above note 8, we have that choice. We can either write 9 or 10, etc., if we want to, or we can indicate that we're going into the higher octave. What I normally do, particularly if I'm going into the higher octave and staying there for a bit, is I'll indicate with an up arrow. That simply means the note next to the up arrow is in the higher octave, and then it stays up there until you see a down arrow. That's the way I teach, which seems to work fine. Everything is in the same octave until you see an arrow. Another way of doing it, which is quite common, is to use dots above or below the note. So a dot below a note means it's simply from the lower octave, and a dot above the note means it's from a higher octave, and no dot means it's where you start. So if a melody starts on the 5, then anything above 8, you would have a dot above that number, and anything below the 1, you would have a dot beneath the number, like this number sequence on the screen. So here we have 5, 5, 8, 8, 5, 5, 8, 8, and then I've put an arrow, meaning we stretch up into the higher octave. I keep bending my neck like that, as if it's going upstairs. We go up into the higher octave to note 2 and then 3, 2 and 3, etc. And we stay up there until we see an arrow to come down. Following that, we've got exactly the same thing, but in a slightly different system. We start with note 5, but with a dot underneath it. So that is an octave lower than the majority of the notes in the melody. And where you put the dot is up to you, really. I would say the best thing to do is the majority of the notes in a melody, you don't want a dot underneath or above. Just to save on ink, really, if you want to save on ink. So we start in the lower octave with 2 5s, and then we're up into the higher octave with 2 1s, and then up to the 5, down to the lower octave again, and then up to the 1. You can see I'm not used to that. And then 2 2 3 3, etc. So those are exactly the same melodies. Of course, it's pretty simple. As long as we use the right numbers, we can indicate different octaves anyhow we want. You might have a better system. There might be a simpler system than both of those. I'd like to hear it. But the arrow seems to work in my experience, particularly with beginners. The dots can be a little bit small. You can miss them, but the arrow is pretty obvious, and you can make the arrow really big if you want. A big arrow. So we should be able to sing this quite easily if we understand the way notes in the default major scale are separated, the gaps between them. Even minus any rhythm, minus the rhythm, we should be able to recognise that tune. If you try, of course with the rhythm, I'm sure you will, because it's pretty well known, especially in London, which is where I am, which is why I'm wrapped up. And the heating's on. Higher numbers in chords. Note 8 is not used in chords because it's exactly the same as note 1, and we can stick it anywhere. We don't have to worry too much about the arrangement of the notes in relation to each other. We can put the root at the top, the root at the bottom. We don't need to use the number 8. But the other numbers, in addition to 1, 3 and 5, like 6, 9, 11, 13, 4, we use those numbers all the time. And those numbers are chord tones. The chord tones are not only 1, 3 and 5, 1 to 7 are all chord tones. And 9, 10, 11, which is the same as 2, 3 and 4, and 13. So if we add a 6, if we add a note 6 to a chord, or chord tone 6, we can describe it as, for instance, F6. We are simply adding chord tone 6 to the chord. So chord tones and chord notation are almost exactly the same principle as note numbers and note number notation. We write a 6, we add a 6 to the chord. F becomes F6 by adding a 6. G is 1, 3 and 5, that's a standard triad, but a G6 chord is 1, 3, 5 and 6. We simply add the 6. 1, 3, 5. 1, 3, 5, 6. G7 chord tones are 1, 3, 5 and flat 7, because G7 really means dominant 7, or G flat 7. 1, 3, 5 and a flat 7. 1, 3, 5, flat 7. Exactly the same as adding notes in a melody. I mean, really, a chord is a melody if you play the notes one at a time. If you play the notes as an arpeggio, which you have no choice to do if you're a trumpet player, you are pretty much just playing a melody when you see a chord. If you play the chord tones in order, of course you don't have to. So with a melody, with note numbers, we obviously play from left to right. We follow the note numbers. If we change the order, it's a different tune. But if we play an arpeggio or a chord, it doesn't matter what it doesn't matter where the numbers exist in relation to each other. The chord is still the same, because the chord is a combination of notes played at the same time. Also, if I say add an 11 to a chord, that means the same as add a 4. And the convention is we normally write 11 after a chord to indicate notes 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 and 11. It accumulates when we write a higher number. Anyway, I digress. The numbers mean the same as all note numbers in music. So putting them into practice, in every scale position we play on guitar, we should know all of the note numbers. Not just guitar, but I'll focus on guitar at the moment. We should know all the note numbers. So I say every scale position, I'm talking about movable positions, not particular numbers of the frets, not like first position, second position, not the classical way. Your positions of your scale, combinations of notes. So if I call that note position 1, if we know all the notes, all the note numbers in our position, we can play our melodies simply without even thinking. We can add numbers to the chord that we see in notation quite easily, even if we've never played the chord before. So for instance, if I can play an A chord, I think I can play an A chord, but I've never played an A6, for instance. As long as I know that note 6 is there, or there, in other words, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I simply add a 6 to the chord. Who needs a chord book? I don't know. I've never had one. So, if we can play a major chord, and we can find the 6, note 6, counting from the root, chord tone 6, we simply add it somehow. We'll often jettison a note to add the new note. So there we are. A, 6. 1, 3, 6. Matter of fact, there's no 5 there. I could play it with a 5, just about. A6. So that's why we use, that's why we want to know all of our numbers in every position. Likewise, if we write a melody and we know we're going to forget it the following morning, as usual, if we don't record it, it helps if you write it down. Of course, we don't always want to write using standard orchestral notation. We can just write numbers down. So if, for instance, anything I like to go, whatever. If I like that and I want to write those numbers down, I write the numbers down. I can play them anytime. Whatever I just wrote. See, I've forgotten it already. That's great. I should have written it down. So I certainly started on number 1. Now, because I come down from 1, it makes sense to call that 8, because immediately it's clear what direction we're going in. So I can't actually remember what I played. So whatever. If I write that down, I would write 8, 8, 8, 8, 6, 8, because I'm going down from the 8 to 6. It doesn't make much sense to go 1, 1, 1, 1, 6, because I've then got to somehow imply that I'm going down to the 6. So that's a good example where using the 8 implies that a 6 is always below it. And then if the next bit goes, I would write 5, 6, 5, 3, 1. That's all. Perfectly plain, because the numbers just follow stepwise. We don't need any arrows or dots. But if I did this, as I dip down into the low 7 beneath the 1, I would have to use some system of indicating the low octave. Because if I wrote 1, 7, 1 with no octave indication, I'm implying that it should be played 1, 7, 1, because 7 is higher than 1. I have thought in the past about dabbling with the idea of going to the nearest note number, but that doesn't really work, because then you've got to remember which is the nearest note number, especially if you jump up a 4th or a 5th. It's not always obvious what the nearest note number is. So 1 to 7, obviously 7 is the nearest note number to 1, the low 7 as opposed to the high 7. But anyway, I don't know why I'm talking about systems that are not very good. I should knock that on the head. So in conclusion, I think note numbers, which include chord tones, are the most important way of notating and describing music, of opening up music theory, especially for beginners, and especially for people that don't necessarily want to learn the classical music notation. It's the best way to get to grips with understanding how music works and how most musicians, certainly modern musicians, converse. Even though, and even classical musicians, they read traditional stave, dots on the stave, they still learn for their theory, they still learn note numbers, degrees of the scale, and they can write them down with the system under, they have a system that they write underneath a number to indicate that it's a number of the scale. That is note numbers. This principle goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. Also, if you understand traditional notation, it is very easy to convert it to note numbers. A good exercise for beginners or for any musician is to put some traditional notated music in front of them and ask them to write the note numbers down. It's very easy, as long as you know the key, and as long as the key doesn't change too much. So, in a nutshell, note numbers are universal for all instruments, including singers. They don't rely on a defined key, so they never need modulating. In other words, you never change the numbers. The numbers to a melody are always the same, regardless of what key you play in, or decide to play them in, or change or modulate even during a song. You can use the same numbers for a different section of the song. If they change key in the song, you don't need to change the numbers. You could just write change key, up a tone, down a tone, whatever way of describing a key change you like. We even use numbers for describing key changes, like up a third, down a third, up a fifth. So we can all, another great reason to use note numbers is that we can all count to 8, hopefully. So note numbers relate directly to everyday concepts, everyday counting concepts. Every time we order things, I don't mean in a restaurant, I mean every time we put things in order, we habitually use numbers. Obvious examples are the calendar, pages of a book, our ages, unfortunately, house numbers, especially if there's only houses on one side when they actually go up in direct number order and not odd or even. Money, of course, clothes sizes, shoe sizes, and of course frets. But the only thing I never number is the guitar strings. And of course, there should be a law against it.